Okay. So, welcome everybody to the ArgLab Research Colloquium, the permanent seminar of the Reasoning and Argumentation Lab at the Universidad Nova de Lisbon. This is the third of this season. We continue with one session per month, online for the time being. The full schedule can be found on our webpage. Our guests today are two distinguished argumentation scholars, Scott Aikin from the Vanderbilt University and John Casey from Northeastern Illinois University. Scott Aikin's research is primarily in epistemology, argumentation theory, and ancient philosophy. And John Casey specializes in the history of philosophy, logic, and critical thinking. Together, they have a common project on fallacies. I'm sure many of you already know of the Ironman Fallacy that they have introduced in 2011. They maintain a blog, thenonsecutor.com, which, in their words, serves as a kind of sandbox for work on argumentation and fallacy theory. And they are preparing a volume on the strawman fallacy. So I will not say more. Today, they will tell us more on the fallacy of meta-argumentation. Scott, John, I'm really happy you are here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this invitation. This is an institution that that John and I have a great deal of respect for and appreciate the work that comes out of it. And so to be able to participate with you in whatever capacity we can, either in person, getting to clink glasses of port and eat the sardines, or here over Zoom is, and I still have my home coffee, so that's okay. John, did you want to say a few things before we get started?
Well, I want to reiterate the sardines point and the drinking point. And yes, we're looking forward to it. Thanks everybody for coming. It's nice to see your faces. You know, if only this way. It's something at least. So it's 20 degrees here. So it would have been nice to change climates.
Yeah, I will say one thing that always happens after a session is that there's always the conviviality afterwards, and the sort of the conversation after the conversation. And I will say that after so many of these Zoom things, I feel like I've been part of something, and then we click end meeting, and then it's just me and the cats.
Yes.
And they're delightful entities, but they are not very good conversationalists. All right, so I'm going to start the share screen now. John and I are going to walk through a PowerPoint. It will take me 1 second to be able to get that up. Okay. Oh, maybe I've got this wrong. One moment. Apologies to everybody. Okay, is that coming through okay for everyone? Okay, fantastic. All right, so this is a talk on fallacies of meta-argumentation. The core thought behind this talk is that this concept, meta-argument, is getting bubbled through, and we're working. We and a number of other folks are working this out. Second is the concept of fallacy, and that one thought that we've had is that if meta-argument is its own thing, then maybe there's a sort of a special class of fallacies that occur at that other level. If we can screw up on the first order, it looks like we can have screw ups on the second order, that's for sure. But the question is whether or not there are either unique fallacies that we commit on that meta level, or at the very least, the best way to explain the errors, certain kinds of errors, is to invoke our meta-argumentation, our thinking or reasoning about reasoning. Now, the important thing to see is that in some ways, the concept of meta-argumentative fallacies has what we might call a controversy trifecta, because it's really in the overlap of three pretty controversial concepts. One of them is just what's argument. We have a good deal of controversy and fallacy in argumentation theory, just figuring out what exactly argument is. we have then a sort of another question is like, okay, well, if we're having controversy about argument, what exactly is meta argument? What's meta all about? What makes meta things meta? And then lastly, there's a good deal of controversy over fallacy. There's folks who say that there's no such thing as fallacies. There are folks who think that fallacies are, you might say, misappropriations or misuses of argument schemes. Others have different theories about fallacies being ways that we've epistemically gone wrong. What's a fallacy? And so again, this concept is in the sort of a triple overlap in the sweet spot of three pretty contested concepts in the literature. Our case here is our initial foray into this. John and I had been writing this book on the straw man, and you'll see a little bit of the results of that book here. The book's pretty much done. We've got it with reviewers now, and so hopefully we'll be out by the end of the year. But as we were working on the book, we really started seeing that a good deal of the problems of the straw man showed up as meta issues, us arguing about arguments. And so we really kind of felt like we needed to get straight about that. And so here's our objective here. To get straight about meta argument, we need to kind of do a handful of things. And so what we want to do here is argue in two stages here that the concept of meta-argumentation is very useful, and especially as an explanatory tool of particular kinds of arguments. So we'll kind of start working out the concept of meta-argument, doing our best to, you might say, be as synthetic as we can with regards to that concept. And then we'll look at some instances of what we think, once we've kind of got the concept of meta-argument relatively well handled, we're going to look at three instances of meta-argumentative fallacies. The straw man, that's our bailiwick. We'll also be looking at the fallacy of both siderism and what's called the free speech fallacy. Okay, John, take it over.
All right, so I don't have the power to animate the slides, so they just come up. We had a meta discussion about this before people arrived, but since Scott is running the presentation, you're going to see the slide as it comes up in its entirety. So there's a meta commentary already. You know, this meta thing had been kind of bothering us for quite a while, actually, like Scott said. And, you know, one thing like in the introduction, Dima mentioned that I do history of philosophy. That's where I started with medieval philosophy in particular. And the kinds of things, I guess, as a stylistic matter, the sorts of questions that interest me, it's like, well, you know, are sort of these semantic conceptual questions. I know it's very general, but I'll tell a story. I was actually making dinner for my in-laws, and my nephew, one of my nephews, was there, and he was like, "Well, what do you do for a job?" And I said, "Well, that's an you know." That's an interesting question. I guess I'm a philosopher, or I teach philosophy. He says, well, what is that? He says, well, let me give you a trick. Every time anybody says anything, you say, well, what do you mean by that? And you're a philosopher. So, and that is, in a sense, like, that's where we start everything. So meta is like, well, what do we mean by meta here? Because meta is a lot of things, and you know, as you know, back to my historian, we'll get to this in a minute. Meta is the Greek word, and you know, and with having studied just a little bit of Greek, you know, it has a bunch of different meanings, and it's a kind of a philosophically hilarious story behind it. So, but I think we're all familiar probably with Maurice Finocchiaro's book on meta-argumentation, and he defines it. There he is, Maurice in the corner. Thank you, Scott. Meta-argument is argument about one or more arguments, or about argumentation in general. It may be contrasted to ground level argument, which is typically about such things as natural phenomena, historical events, and human action. So I in the paper version of this talk, I have an example. I have an argument about ducks, in particular Dutch hookbills. It's a type of duck. It's got a hookbill, and it's from the Netherlands, in honor of the people in argumentation. Example. So There's an argument about ducks, and it's basically a Barbara type syllogism about ducks. You know, all Dutch hookbills are ducks. All ducks are birds, so all Dutch hookbills are birds. So that's an argument about ducks. I think everyone would agree to that. If I switched out the terms in that argument, I could make it an argument about arguments. And so all arguments are, you know, etc. I forget the exact example, but I think the point is clear that it's just like these are two different arguments, in the content of the one is argument, the content the other is ducks, the duck related argument. What's the difference really? It strikes me as this sense of about maybe missing something, that there's more to meta, there's something more to the concept of a meta argument than just the content of the argument. And another reason to think this is, think about the arguments. I mean, arguments are sort of abstract contents in a way, insofar as they're contents of arguments. So if you're talking about, well, you know, all categorical syllogisms are types of argument. That's a type of abstract notion. We have arguments about abstract notions all the time, and it seems like arguments about arguments are just like arguments about other abstract notions. It's not particularly interesting that the argument has argument as its content. So moving on to the next slide. So there are several different senses of meta, and this is what I was referring to earlier with the Aristotle business. And one sense of meta is beyond or above. And you think of sort of increasing levels of abstraction. So for those of you who teach logic, for instance, you have the language, right? Then you have the meta language, and the meta language is a kind of more abstract version of the first order language, or the object language, right? And sometimes people use I don't know, fancy books will use Greek letters. People who have pedagogical mindset will use boxes and triangles to move it out of that entirely. But you can use anything you want as the different kind of language. But the idea is that the meta language is beyond or it's above, representing another level of abstraction. We can have a lot more examples of this. But it's the idea is that it's representing content in a certain way at the first level. So that's one kind of a second sense of meta. And it makes, in so doing, you can kind of make, just to stick with the logic example, you can make the norms of the first order language explicit, right? So it's like here we're talking about modus ponens, which applies to some abstract or some jumble of symbols and whatnot. It makes it more explicit that that's what's really at issue, and then you can have languages up the ladder. But so that's a second critical sense of meta that is relevant to what meta argument could be. So, ding. Now there's another sense of meta, which is the fun sense of meta you might get by watching movies. I don't know how many are familiar with Charlie Kaufman films, maybe a couple of nods. Let's see, what was the Adaptation? If anyone has seen the movie Adaptation, it's a meta film. It's meta theater, meta cinema, I guess, because the adaptation in the story, it's a movie adaptation, and part of the story is the adaptation of the very movie to cinema. So there's it was a book about orchids, and Charlie Kaufman, who's the director or the writer, wrote himself into the story about the adaptation. And so you have meta theater in that way of breaking the fourth wall, things where you make explicit the things that are going on. And this is relevant to meta argument because in our view, and this is something we talked about in the Straw Man book, and this is a term that I wish we had written it, but I'm going to say it. It's going to sound kind of funny, but argument is is turgid. So it is turgid. It is full of of self-reference in igitur in Latin, of course, is therefore. So it's full of therefore-ness, which is a meta feature. It's like in a play, when you say, I mean, and this ruins the play unless it's a meta play, when, you know, somebody steps up and says, all right, everybody get ready for tragic recognition, or now this scene is over, let's move to the next scene, right? All right, so I've talked a lot about this slide. So in a meta sense, let's move on to the next sense of meta. All right, so here I apologize again. This would be animated and be very, very impressive, but because I don't control the thing, it's all at once. So meta in the sense of metaphysics there's an interesting story in itself, as many of you probably know. Andronicus of Rhodes in 60 or so BC was cataloging the works of Aristotle, putting them, lining up in a shelf and collecting them. And so he's got the book on the soul, right? So on the soul goes there. He's got the book on the categories, goes there. He's got the book on the physics, all the books on the physics, the stuff on natural things, change and whatnot, goes there. And then he's got these other books and he says, well, these go after the physics. Boom. And that's metaphysics. Ta meta ta physica, the books after the physics. So these are books that just come after in order. So there's a sense of meta that is after. Now, of course, there's also metaphysics is in a sense kind of above, but this sense of after is really significant, we think, for meta-argument, because there's a sense in which meta-argument comes on the heels of other arguments, and it's about those arguments. So Maurice is definitely right about that. It's about those arguments, but it's about them also after them. It regards them, but it comes on the heels of them. And I think a person really who noted this very poignantly is Dan Cohen. They're portrayed there on the left, not on the upper. That's Aristotle. And Dan outlined several different kinds of meta-argument. And knowing Dan, as many of you do, they all have kind of funny acronyms. So the one we have here, there are several, is the meta-argument for rejecting bad arguments. And I'd like to add that, I'll pause it, I'll add that in a second, but the meta-argument for rejecting bad arguments is you have, say, some argument that seems fallacious, you can't put your finger on it. I get this a lot from my wife when we argue. She says, that's something, and I know it's something, and I can't identify it, and because I argue fallaciously a lot. But she doesn't know the name for it. So she works pretty much this Marber principle on me, which is I can't put my finger on what is wrong with your argument. And I'm not patting myself on the back for this, by the way. And that arguments that seem fallacious because they have unacceptable conclusions are really usually are. And so don't accept the conclusion. So this is an argument on the heels of another argument. It's an argument about that argument, but it doesn't go inside of the argument in the normal way that we think about evaluating arguments. So for instance, it doesn't evaluate the truth or falsity of the premises or the logical connection and conclusion. It just sort of overlooks it and says, well, there must be something fishy about this argument. I can't put my finger on it. And there's a principle which Dan calls the principle of meta-rationality, which is sort of generates all of Dan's meta-argument forms. And that allows me to take this stand on this argument. Now, there's another version, a similar version of this argument from Hugh Breakey, just came out in Argumentation, discusses meta-argumentation in almost exactly this way, that you have an argument that has some kind of horribly offensive or otherwise terrible conclusion. That's kind of a meta reason for rejecting the argument or for doing something in regard to the argument. This is going to come up, this sort of foregrounds what's going to come up when Scott talks about the free speech fallacy in a minute. So this last sense of meta then is very critical, we think, to the understanding of what meta argument is and how meta fallacies work, because it's involved in evaluation, and then it's involved in this other concept. If you're familiar with some of Scott's other work with Rob Talese, the Owl of Minerva is an image that we learn things in the evaluation of arguments. We learn things and then we reflect back on our performances. So it's meta in that accumulating sense. And so we then apply those norms to arguments going into the future, like the argument with a terrible conclusion. We use that as a form of argument. So it's kind of a self-generating, self-replicating kind of system. Bing. Last slide here. So in a meta sense, signposting here, we're coming to the conclusion of this part, this initial part. I don't want to really belabor the point here, perhaps going on a little bit too long, that there's sort of three kind of axes for the meta argument lessons that we've talked about. There's an evaluative sense, that's the meta language versus the object language sense. There's a normative sense, it tells you, well, what's good. And there's a further explanatory sense that explains how the norms work. So this should set the stage then for our discussion of particular fallacies of meta-argumentation, which I think will illustrate kind of what's going on here. Ding, Scott.
I have to remember to unmute myself. I said something brilliant. So one of the crucial things is that we see that meta argument plays a variety of roles, and maybe one of the things that we want to keep in mind when we are theorizing it is also kind of keep in mind what we're trying, why we've got it, why we do it, what we're trying to accomplish with it. And so one of the places to start is with the straw man. So there's the earring, the very famous earring, but something's wrong, right? It's more like the ear wrong. I'm not seeing any laughter aside from John. You're not, good to have you in the audience, bud. So that's a famous painting. That's an infamous bad representation of that painting. But the crucial thing about the straw man fallacy, and one thing to even recognize about the straw man, is that it looks like it's an outlier. And so maybe one place to start is that the straw man looks like it's an outlier to the theory that fallacies are misapplications or bad applications of argument schemes. And because there's no real scheme, there's not a scheme with the straw man. It doesn't look like there's any form that it takes. It looks like it's something that happens really between arguments. There's not really a scheme that gets applied with it. So this functional, almost an argument about arguments element of straw man, I think, is one of the important things. And given the way that John and I have been working on the straw man, we think that the straw man view, at the very least classically, requires a few moving parts. One of them is that you represent so again, standard straw man. We're not talking about any of the special really the special straw man bestiary that John and I have been thinking about beyond just the standard version. But you represent an opponent's view as worse than they actually are. So hence the ear wrong instead of the ear ring. You have a critique of that representation. Sometimes that's implicit. You just shrug, or you just say it in the voice like they're dumb, or you express outrage. And then you close the exchange. You say, look, we're done with them. And one of the important things is that the representation of another's argument is meta-argument. What you're doing is you're arguing about their argument. In critiquing it, you are saying something that's gone wrong with their argument. So you invoke some norm, you hold it to a normative evaluation. And then in closing the exchange, what you say is there's nothing more to say here. Nothing more to see here, move on, get on with it. And so in some ways, it's an argument that comes on the heels of another argument. We've seen that before. That's our friend Dan Cohen's meta-argument for rejecting bad arguments. And so one of the ways we think that the best way to think about the straw man is to think of it as setting up for a marba. setting up for a meta argument for rejecting bad arguments. And the problem with the straw man is that it's a sort of a hastily constructed marba. And so one of the strategies then is to say, look, one of the ways for us to be able to see when the reasoning goes bad is to think that it's really rooted not in the sort of the first order reasoning, it's rooted in our reasoning about reasoning. And mastering that concept, again, is going to start with us looking at instances, but it looks like there are special kinds of fallacies that you just have to have this concept for. So it looks like, for example, I can have the fallacy of asserting the consequent. And I can do that when thinking about sort of anything, right? I can do that whenever I'm thinking about the gross national product of Finland. I can do it when I'm thinking about cats, and I can do that in the object language, no problem. It looks like to commit the straw man, I have to have the concept of an argument, right? I have to have the concept of evaluating an argument. I have to kind of step up and be like, that reasoning sucks. And so that uniqueness, that difference between, you might say, the fallacy of that you can commit without any meta concepts versus the fallacy that you commit and it looks like you have to have the meta concepts, that distinction looks like a really important distinction for us. And so again, you can commit the fallacy of asserting the consequent when doing it about arguments, but it looks like you don't have to. Whereas it looks like straw man is not something that you can do without the concept of argument and your reasoning about it. So one of the crucial things that we've seen, at least with regards to the straw man, is that it's about another argument. One of the other things that we think that also sort of flows downstream from this, because we think that there are diachronic elements to fallacies. For example, John's got a really great theory about how ad baculum arguments are not just fallacious in terms of the in situ, right? But it's also got a diachronic element, which is that folks on the outside will now don't have access to that evidence and maybe make inferences about the quality of that argument. That you might say the one who said lead pipe, pal, actually won the argument as opposed to just threaten the other person. So the important thing here with the straw man is that we're making inferences about the argument that got made. We're making inferences about the arguer. So take a look at our painter here, right? We had an earlier version of that painting, right? What is, like, if a painter painted another painter painting a painting that looked like that painting. Now, does the word painting mean anything anymore? Said it too many times. If we had a painter paint another painting, painting that painting, and that's what the straw man ultimately is doing, it's not just saying that that's a sucky painting. It's also saying that that painter is a crappy painter, right? That representation of the product that that other painter produced says something about them as a painter. It's a kind of creates a track record about them. Moreover, one of the ways that this does, that we start making inferences about, you might say, having this debate at all, is, you might say, painting the opposition of one side of this debate. Again, the implicature of exchanging and representing and critiquing someone in an argumentative exchange is that we might say you're operating on a kind of, we're going to be talking about the best versions of the views. The implicature is that we're going to go out and try to talk to the best versions. And if these knuckleheads are the best versions of the view, then that side of the argument's not got a lot of good representatives. That gives us maybe some good inductive evidence to say that maybe that's just a loser view. So the thought here is that once we see this sort of cumulative case, it's about the argument, it's about the arguer, and then about the debate overall, we see that it's got synchronic consequences, that it's, you might say, it's misrepresentation of this particular argument, but it's also a representation of the arguer and the debate overall, and whether or not it's even worth having with them or at all. Okay, so back to John. Gotta unmute yourself.
I can't hear you.
I can't. What I said was so on the spot. I can't recreate it, but let me try. Scott said something about this ad baculum business, and there's another wrinkle to that, and I think that's a perfect tie-in here with the straw man and whatnot, because you have, say, arguments as Finocchiaro describes them, ground level arguments where, I mean, look, the point is I offer you evidence, and that evidence is supposed to guide you in some epistemic way to the conclusion that I identify. And that works when it works, when that evidence does that, and it doesn't work when that evidence doesn't do that. But meta-argumentation, it kind of interrupts that relationship. And to think about, to go back to the theater analogy, I think there's a kind of telling way to imagine this. Theater, you go to the theater, and we're going to continue the Aristotelian view of the theater. We're going to be purged of pity and fear. We're going to see a tragedy, right? So we're going to watch Hamlet or something. And maybe a Greek play, Oedipus, right? That was, I think, Aristotle's favorite. We're going to watch that one. We're going to be drawn in to the action, and the purging of pity and fear, and all the other effects are going to happen directly based on the presentation of the story. But the narrative and all the singing, the meta play really interrupts that automaticness of it. And so meta arguing, it kind of interrupts that automatic feature of arguing where you're taking evidence and converting it in somebody else's mind to commitment or belief or something like that. Here you're stopping that and pointing to it and saying, hey, look, here comes the evidence. Now, in a certain sense, as we said, argument is igi turgid. It's like that's what argument is. It is a kind of self-referential, self-conscious signaling of things, like the signposting that I tell my students to do in papers. I said, look, there is no shame in starting your paper by saying the thesis of this paper is, however, if you do that in a play, you're doing meta theater now. The thesis of this play is that, this guy has these tragic flaws and avoid them, or whatever the point of that is. So what is interesting about this, I think, and what really kind of underscores the meta-argumentative project here that we're working on is that you're taking elements of argument like the evidence and whatnot, and you're converting them in a different way. So back to the ad baculum on that score, I threaten somebody, which I frequently do. As I mentioned, I use a lot of fallacies. I threaten somebody to draw some conclusion. Obviously, that person isn't going to believe that. However, down the line, I can, knowing the way that people interpret the fact that arguments have taken place, knowing the way that gets interpreted, the meta-argumentative posture that people take, that can be converted into evidence for the viability of my point of view. So if I get you to shut up about making objections to this view on meta-argument, and please, maybe, I don't know, maybe I know stuff about you guys, and I'd say stuff if you raised objections to our view, then people will think, wow, wait, these two jokers from America gave a talk and nobody objected. It must be pretty good, right? So hopefully that will work out for us. So that's kind of what's in the background. And so now to switch over to this both siderism business, part of my slide is eaten up by the faces, so the both siderism is our name for what is called a bunch of different things and doesn't really have an account, like a standard account. There's no book by Doug Walton on it. There's no article in Argumentation on it. There are articles in Argumentation certainly about things in the neighborhood, and it's mentioned, and especially recently, in particular, Van Laaren-Krabbe in 2019 and a couple of other recent pieces discuss this idea of fallacy of the middle ground. That is a kind of, all right, so you say tomato, I say tomato. So why don't we say, it's not the best analogy, but why don't we compromise on the correct pronunciation must be between tomato and tomato. Some compromise between there. Now, so that's the fallacy of middle ground as they describe it. Walton and Krabbe in 1995 in the Commitment and Argumentation book describe what they call the fallacy of bargaining, which is a very similar kind of thing, although they give it, there's an apparatus here to explain the meta problem. So a fallacy of bargaining is basically to go from one type of situation, a critical discussion, where the point is how well supported views are, to a negotiation, which has different standards. And so you're now bargaining on what's true, right? So you know, this is actually Scott's example, and I've been dying to give it. So you're having a disagreement with a friend who's an Olympian, believes in the 12 Olympian gods, right? You're an atheist, you believe in none. So your friend says, look, all right, fine. We just can't, you can't see my arguments, I can't see yours. Let's just draw the line in the middle. There are 6 gods. 6. That's the fallacy of bargaining. Now, I think the best version of this is actually from Whately in 1826, which he describes in pretty exquisite detail with all sorts of examples. He calls it the fallacy of objections. And what it is I wish I could move this thing. Oh, there I can. What do you know? I just moved it. So you've got objections with regard to some question, right? So there must be something to those objections from the mere fact of those objections being objections, right? Now, he doesn't actually describe it. And what's different with Whately here is the meta move doesn't entail this negotiation switch. So it's not necessarily that. There's a kind of epistemic feature to it. So it's not like you encounter the objections and you immediately move to negotiation. You sort of move to another, there's all sorts of options for you with regard to the disagreement, right? So you encounter disagreement. So now the question is, well, what does that mean? And the both-siderism occurs when you draw some conclusion about that. We have that, I think, in the next slide described. Yes, both-siderism. All right, so here's an example. And I've got 2 other examples that I thought were, speaking of arguments with terrible conclusions, they were too terrible to make slides of. I'll just sort of describe them to you. Here you have Solomon splitting a baby, the wisdom, that's the wisdom of Solomon there. The 2 women disagreed about the baby, so Solomon's recommendation was to cut the baby in half, and there you have the baby on the table. So this is a climate change example, and your people are probably pretty familiar with this. This argument form has got kind of a long heritage. So this is Kelly Craft. She's the U.S. ambassador to Canada, appointed by the previous president, whose name I forget. So in a conversation, she's sort of famous for this sort of stuff. She's the wife of a coal executive, a billionaire. And they said, well, do you believe in climate change? That was the question from the reporter, the CBC. And she replied, well, I believe there are scientists on both sides that are accurate. That was an approximation of what she said, because it came out garbled. Then she followed up. She said, wait a minute. She said, well, I think that both sides, and you even got both sides in there, have their own results from their studies. And I appreciate and respect both sides in science. It's like, yeah, wow, she must have passed critical thinking or something like that. That's some really sterling reasoning there. So this kind of, there are sides in a longstanding debate is kind of the hallmark of both-siderism. And this is one reason we distinguish it from the middle ground fallacy and the fallacy of bargaining, because it isn't necessarily a bargaining in a middle ground, but more importantly, it's really not, what's operative is not the 2 people in the disagreement, right? It's not like climate scientists are going to say, all right, okay, so all these coal scientists are disagreeing with us, let's compromise with them. They're not going to do that. They're going to stand their ground, as it were. The audience, however, who's not observing and participating in the argument, will draw conclusions about the argument that's happening. And the conclusion will be, well, there must be something to these objections if we keep hearing them, right? There must be, so, a reasonable person would, can draw all sorts of conclusions. A reasonable person would, split the difference or discount, it's the discount some, by, I don't know, 23%. I have a colleague who always gives specific percentages. So this is going to discount the credibility of the scientist by 23% and the other guys by 21. And you're going to come up with some view that way. But that's a meta-argumentative move because it's not assessing the argument in its first instance, but in a second instance without evaluating the fact of the arguing. The other two examples, America is an interesting place, and it's a, well, now that's what I can say by way of a preamble on this example. There was a school in Texas, and they were teaching the period of the Civil War, American history, and so they're discussing slavery. And so somebody thought, what would be a great assignment to really teach people sort of reasoning. And this again kind of highlights the fact that, like straw man, you're not dealing with a scheme of a single argument. You're dealing with relations between arguments at another level. So they thought this, this would be a really great examples to make students sort of list the pros and cons of slavery, like what were the goods and what were and then that way they sort of kind of line them up against each other and have a greater understanding of the phenomena. So thinking along these same lines was another school, high school, this time in Virginia, where somebody thought, the principal had no position on whether the Holocaust occurred, but only knew that one side said it did, and there are people who said that it didn't, and it's important to teach the debate, right? So this is in the discussion of evolution in the United States, which is one of those, once again, America things, is like, this is a huge debate here, whether that is you can teach that in a public school. The teach the controversy is a kind of both-siderist move. And this is something, again, noted by Whately, is that and it's going to come up in the next slide. So maybe, bing, moving on to the next slide, bringing us to the errors of the problems of both-siderism, is that obviously the fact that there's a debate, say the evolution debate, or the climate change debate, or it doesn't mean that you have two sides with the same quality of views. You're going to have any number of sides. This is something even Whately said. It's like, yeah, you have an argument. There are always going to be sides. There's always going to be that person and that, somebody like, once again, America, we have Q, that's a side now. So Scott had written about that on Monday, I think. So the fact that there are these two sides doesn't entail that they have quality views. And the second feature of both-siderism, the second error, is that it even if you have two sides with quality views, it doesn't entail that the truth is going to be somehow in the middle or in some kind of compromise. There's an Italian version of this, or what I'm going to call an Italian version of this, a political movement in post-war, like late World War II Italy, called Qualunquismo, which rejected partisanship. So the fact that partisanship was kind of evidence for rejecting both sides, rejecting the contributions of both sides and opting for some totally different solution. That's a very condensed version of that. So no follow-up questions on that. Thank you. There's two pragmatic problems that arise from both-siderism. And they're both sort of meta-pragmatic, meta-argumentative problems. The first is that it rewards, and this is once again American media, it rewards trollish contrarianism. So that is people just taking an outrageous view for the sake of the outrageous view. Now that view has, for reasons that we're going to see as we move to the next slide, not yet, but in a second, not yet, thank you. free speech reason. So this gets lined up with that element of meta-argumentation as well, like who is free to participate. So that they get rewarded. They get outsized, they have outsized representation in the debate because they have a different view. And lastly, this is something that David Godden and I worked on in 2020 with regard to Jan Albert van Laar and Eric Kraba's work on compromising, is that both siderism encourages what we call argumentative overcharging. And this is kind of when you argue for more than you intend to be able to prove. And so overcharging is a phenomenon in the American legal system, maybe in others, where you charge for the maximum number of things that you can plausibly claim to have evidence maybe for. So somebody breaks into a store, or somebody vandalizes a store, imagine, some kid. And so you charge them with grand larceny and all sorts of other stuff, and other kinds of crimes that are lesser included in offenses. And you do so in a way to get them to concede. So it encourages that since obviously the participants are that's not going to be effective for the participants against each other. It will be effective though, again, with both siderism and the other meta things we're working on here, it will be effective on an audience. And so so with this, we can see this actually with the free speech debate, which is the slide next. Bing.
Maria, or a quick question. Are we set for 45 minutes? Was that our, okay. Yeah. So, right. So I will be very, very brief. I'll just say some meta things. So the crucial thing about that's the classic Norman Rockwell. That's, there's our updated version. And the thought behind free speech norms is that you're just trying to meet a total evidence requirement, just like with the both-siderism. You're trying to just get all the views in. Some folks, your famous Grutendorst and Van Emeren freedom rule. Yeah, Talisa and I did something on that too. There's Senator Josh Hawley. We've got something about the January 6th business. But the point here is that the way that the free speech fallacy gets deployed is that folks will portray criticism of their view as censorship of their view. And on the one hand, that's a way of just rebutting the criticism. You say something, you get criticized, and then you say, well, I'm just exercising my free speech. It's a free country, ain't it? And so that's a way of saying that either the criticism is unfounded or that one doesn't have to respond to it. So that's one way that the free speech fallacy is deployed. The second one is that it's played as an intensifier of one's view, because one says that one's getting the criticism and one is getting the institutional pushback, because one's onto something. They're trying to cover something up. And so one takes the outrage expressed by the other side as meta evidence, namely that there's evidence, right? They wouldn't be so angry if I didn't say these sorts of things. So a couple, just very briefly to wrap up, what we're seeing with these meta-argumentative fallacies is that in some ways they're misapplications or they're misuses of meta-epistemic rules. One is a pragmatic epistemic rule. We don't have a slide for this, but one's a pragmatic epistemic rule, which is don't waste resources, don't waste intellectual resources on dead ends. You don't have to, life's short, you have finite resources to be able to figure out the truth. Once you start getting good inductive evidence that this debate is over, you should move on to other more fruitful things. And that's kind of how the straw man fallacy works. It works on that kind of a misapplication of that meta use, you might call it an epistemetric principle. Both the free speech fallacy and the both-siderist fallacy work on another meta-epistemic principle, which is, you might say, a principle of total evidence. That what you're trying to do is get all the evidence in. And so the opinions of others is meta evidence. It's evidence that there's evidence, and you're trying to get them all in and have them as part of the debate. The problem is that people can strategically deploy those principles in order to prolong debates, to create doubt, or to nevertheless improve their own views, despite the fact that and portray themselves as though they have views that are oppressed, or views that are being inappropriately silenced, whenever they in fact have been duly refuted. So what the crucial thing is, with each one of these, we have to be able to, in some ways, they're not errors that we make whenever we reason about the things. They're errors that we make when we reason about how we reason about the things. Okay, that's it.
So thank you, Scott and John, for this interesting talk, interesting also from an artistic point of view. I shall now open the discussion. So if you have a question or a comment, please raise your virtual hand. And for those who are following on Facebook, you can leave your question as a comment on the live stream. Dima and I will voice them out here in the Zoom. So I see.
I'm going to pause really briefly, and I forgot to also give a quick shout out to Martian's work. Martian was one of the first people to identify the meta element of the straw man fallacy, and so he was the first one to find that breadcrumb. We continued that. So thanks, Martian, for planting that seed.
So the first one is Dima.
Thank you so much, Scott and John, for the really interesting presentation. And my question actually is exactly about that meta element in the straw man. I just want to clarify if you take all straw man to have this meta element or not, because I'm thinking of cases of refutation when you are arguing against a position and you misrepresent that position. So you're not necessarily making a comment about the argument, but you're taking the conclusion out of context, for example. So it seems to me that there are cases where you are committing the straw man by distorting a premise or the conclusion without necessarily be making a point about the argument. Of course, at some level of interpretation, this ends up being like that, but if you go to that interpretation, maybe all refutations are like that. So in that sense, I would like you to say a little bit more how you can maintain that meta interpretation without turning all refutations meta-argumentation.
This is a great question. And I might have point about the question. So the first thing to say is that John and I have got a little bit of a controversial view. We think that all argument has got a meta-argumentative element to it. So your point here is that like there's a kind of this is a sort of a night in which all the cows are black. Fair enough. But we think that there are degrees of meta that happen, and so you might say all argument is weakly meta. In the sense in which, like, even if you perform modus ponens without invoking modus ponens, you nevertheless think whenever you say therefore, you think you did something right? You're evaluating yourself and you're sort of giving yourself a little self high five. So I think that there is a kind of a meta element to most argument, but that's a sort of a really weak notion of meta. The more strongly notion of meta is going to be in terms of the stepping back and being about. I suppose that the issue is whether or not all misinterpretations are straw person or straw man arguments. Like if I mishear you, right, and I respond to what I misheard, is that a straw man argument? I suppose I may have to just bite the bullet and say yes. I do think though that insofar as what happens when you have these misinterpretations, they create track records that we then make inferences on the basis of. And so in some ways, what they are is, in some ways, when you create a track record, what you're doing is you're creating meta evidence. creating meta evidence about you as an arguer, how this debate has gone, and is, you might say, is preparing us to make a sort of a more explicit, strongly meta inference. Is that okay? John, did you want to add anything to that? I'm sorry.
No, well, no, that you're right to distinguish between the strongly and the weakly meta-argumentative, and I think you did note the. I was going to reply by misinterpreting your question, so I'm grateful that you spoke up because.
So, like, just to clarify that, to continue the clarification. So, your meta fallacies are in the weak sense or in the strong sense?
So our conception of meta-argumentative fallacy is in the strong sense.
Okay, so not all refutations, not all fallacies committed during refutation would count as meta-argumentative fallacies.
Correct.
Yeah, in the strong sense.
In the strong sense.
Eric?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for this talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering about the role of good and bad faith in the examples you were giving. So my impression is, from personal experience, that many strawmans and many accusations of both siderism are somehow connected to accusations of accusing someone of arguing in bad faith, or I don't know how you call it in English. What's the best term for it? So I was wondering what the connection is, or whether that is part of your conception of these meta-arguments.
Great question. So going back to Whately in 1826, he describes so you've got a couple of perspectives on like both siderism. One is, and this is the perspective of Sterling, who wrote, so it was, it was it was a book, a compendium of the 100 worst fallacies ever. And Scott and I have cut something in it. It's in a pile here on my floor. Scott's got it. Yes, there it is. So, and it's got little entries on, so Scott and I did one on straw man and free speech fallacy. That's by the way, an advertisement for that book in our, I put advertisements in my talk, by the way. Now I lost through the jokes. The bad faith, the perspective. So Sterling, who wrote the entry on what he called the fallacy of middle ground. And, interestingly, just on that little historical note, Van and Krabbe, there really isn't any literature on this fallacy. They didn't know about the Whately one, but they cited Wikipedia saying, well, there isn't a whole lot. There's this Wikipedia entry that calls it by this Latin name, argumentum ad temperantiam, which, for students of the history of fallacy names is hilarious because they're all like late additions that sound cool, right? And that sounds pretty cool. So the Whately version describes foregrounds the bad faith element of both siderism. So to Eric's question, he's pointing the finger at the objector. That's why he calls it the fallacy of objection. So a bad faith objector can prolong a debate longer than it should go, or can get people to like, I can't really decide, so we're going to stay with the status quo ante, that kind of thing. Aristotle has kind of a version of this where if you just throw out so many arguments, nobody can reply, people draw the conclusion that, well, this must be more complicated than it seems. So bad faith is certainly operative in the Whately description. In the other description, and this is the meta thing, and this is what I think is interesting about meta arguing, and especially with the straw man, the ad baculum thing that Scott mentioned and that I followed up on, is that you're converting what would not be very good arguments into reasons by manipulating what people do at the meta level of interpretation. So a bad faith person can inject objections, just keep making objections. And look, we've all encountered maybe this person like on the non sequitur, Scott, that was mentioned by Dima at the beginning. We've had a lot of conversations with people who they take issue. One person just couldn't climate change just couldn't do it. Just like it was a conspiracy. And he would write these enormously long things, just these huge. It's like, I'm not going to reply to that. I mean, first of all, our perspective on this argument is a meta perspective, because we're just, neither of us are climate scientists, and we're actually talking about the meta nature of the argument. We don't want to have the climate change argument, but those things come up and then get converted by the bad faith actor into the minds of the audience. So combining the two kinds of perspective on both siderism, that's how the meta thing is working. So yeah, you're right. It absolutely is an important feature of the bad faith, and I hope I answered. Scott, did you have anything to add to that?
I add one thing. So I love the idea of one explanatory part of this, Eric, being that it's bad faith, and it does connect a number of things up with argumentative norms, and you might say other argumentative virtues, being the right kind of person, right? Developing the right kinds of habits and character to argue. I think that the second thing about the bad faith is that it's not just deployed face-to-face in the dialogue, it's also deployed for an onlooking audience. It's a sort of a consistent puzzle about the effectiveness of certain fallacies, right? Like the whole theory of a fallacy is that they're supposed to be somehow look good to somebody, but how in the world could like the ad baculum look good to you, right? How in the world could you fall for the ad baculum? How could someone straw man you to your face and be like, oh, looks like I'm refuted now, right? Crucial thing is that it's deployed often for onlooking audiences, folks who are not part of that dialogue, who maybe are not experts, but they're like, they want to say like, look, I gave them a whole big argument, and then they were like, and then they brushed me off. What's that about, right? And so I think that idea that there's another kind of level to this. There's a sort of a thicker concept that's a sort of a character style concept that can do some explanatory work there too. So an excellent observation, Eric. Thank you.
So we have two more questions for now, Marcin and then Gilbert, and I leave the floor to Marcin.
Okay, thank you. So this is really great, obviously, and thanks for the mention. And I could talk with you for half an hour about that, but I have a very specific part here that relates to the very notion of meta and meta-argumentation. So, in philosophy, I understand quite well the difference between semantics and meta-semantics, and between ethics and meta-ethics, for example. But then there is another type of difference, let's say, between cognition and metacognition. Okay, and argumentation can be understood as a certain, discipline, or can be understood as an activity. Now, I understand that you're talking about activity, so by very definition, reason giving is a normative activity. So metacognition, did I see it? Well, I mean, so it's a self-corrective activity, obviously. So it's very much, it's not one way, it's a two-way street, okay? So that your evaluation impacts your perception of object. So now with argumentation, now when you were presenting, and the first part anyway, I thought that what is argumentation? It's an interactive activity on giving and criticizing reasons. That means that any argumentation is a meta-argument, because in argumentation, when you enter a dialogue, you are evaluating someone else's argument. So it is by definition. And how can you evaluate someone else's argument? Well, there are, wrong premises and a wrong inference, and then, well, many other things, but these are the crucial ones. And then I thought, wow, actually, it's even deeper than that. And when you were giving answer to Dima, I guess that even argument, not just argumentation, is meta, because if you understand argument, well, it depends, but not as an abstract, well, then you enter the definition. So I would like to hear your answer on that if I construct arguments, even just for myself, so some kind of reasoning, if it's deliberate, there is immediately an evaluative part. When I deliberate, it's an internal deliberation. I weigh reasons, I consider things, I try to construct different inferences, and it's normal, it's almost, so my question is, by your definition, wouldn't any normative activity be just at the same time a meta activity? Because So this is the question. And then, so how deep, again, how deep it goes? I perfectly take your examples, that's correct, but maybe it's much deeper than you presented.
Well, just I'll start because I know Scott has something to say about this. I think so David Godden, who I don't think is here, had a piece in Topoi about it was about meta-argumentation, interestingly, and it involved a long discussion of the Fino Chiaro book. And it was the resources, the topic was the resources of meta-argumentation, a resource audit of meta-argumentation for the problem of deep disagreement. And along the way, very early in the piece, he gives us sort of a description of arguing. He's like, well, what's arguing about, you know? And so in Scott, at the beginning of the talk is, you know, we got the trifecta of problems. And one is the first one is, and like you mentioned in your question, you know, what's arguing all about? And, you know, there's a sense, and this is actually another project. So just another advertisement. I think in May in Lethbridge, Scott and I will be talking about this other thing, which is agreement, the problem of agreement and argumentation. And so there's some Dima stuff in there too, so I hope she can make it. There, the idea is like, you know, what's argument all about? And you look at a lot of standard conceptions of argument, and it's the answer is, well, it's disagreement and there's some kind of problem. And just to mention David's description, because it's kind of Heideggerian, strangely, because I don't know if David is much of a Heideggerian, but that you kind of do argument when something is broken. You know, it's like, well, wait a minute, you know, what are my reasons for this? Or like, you know, I want to ride home on my bike with a bottle of wine in a basket. Why is that a bad idea? Or a good idea? What are my reasons for that? So that there's some kind of thing that's off with that. Our view, I think, if I could speak for the both of us on this, is argument is weakly meta-argumentative, that it's always kind of meta-argumentative in a weak sense. The question, what we're trying to distinguish here, and is the strong sense of meta-argument, that there's still more to the concept of meta beyond the initial meta-ness of, which is meta kind of, that's so cool. That's going in the paper. Thank you, Marcin. The meta-ness of you know, normativity. I mean, that's meta, like the igi turgidity of argument. It's like you use modus ponens and you know, it's like giving yourself a high five. It's like, therefore, it's like, boom, I did it. I had these reasons and I concluded I'm self-evaluating. I'm thinking about my reasoning. So I think that's the weak sense. And then the strong sense, I think, is the project that we're sort of explicitly working on here. I'll let Scott finish the.
I'm going to be really brief because I know that we've got other questions. So Marcin, the question's awesome because in some ways, one version of it is whether or not the dialectical element of reasoning has to be meta. Whether or not that strong notion of meta is really just another way for us to present the dialectical elements. So if I say, for example, I need to be able to make my premises fit something that is appropriate to you, right? You might say the audience indexing. I am reasoning about the reasoning already, right? Just trying to be able to give you reasons that would be acceptable, which is the reason why we put the PD stuff in the paper. If we had presented to somebody else, we might have taken that PD stuff out and put in some epistemic stuff. And so, you know, I think that there's definitely something to this thought that you might say the meta argumentation element of thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it is on the one hand certainly the weak element, but whenever it goes dialectical, it looks like we are reasoning about the arguments as arguments full bore all the while, even thinking about reasoning argument together as sort of weighing reasons. You're already kind of making an argument like that's not a good reason, or that you're already doing that. And so it may be a much more ambitious project. Right now, we're just starting with fallacies and saying, you know, this is a relatively defined little domain of discourse. And it kind of works like that. It kind of works like abnormal psychology, where it's like, we're going to have a theory of healthy human beings and healthy argument by looking at how we mess up. That's kind of what we're doing with the fallacy theory generally, I think. And I think that's kind of what we're doing with the meta-argumentation. We try to get out the norms of meta-argumentation by looking at the places where we break it first. It's Heidegger's red hammer.
Yeah, sorry, just super quick follow-up to what John also said. But in this sense, the very notion of disagreement, at least, is meta-argumentative. Because why would I disagree with anyone in the first place? Because I think that they have weak reasons for what they say or think, right? So
Yeah.
So Gilbert, please.
Yeah, thank you. Where did you get that picture of Dan? He looks balder than I recall. In fact, it almost looks like a painting.
It is a painting. I think, was it painted?
It's I don't know who painted it, but it's on his. He chose it, so it's on his philosopher Phil Peoples page, or they run by the APA.
Okay. More seriously, I was wondering two things. I think they may be related. First, at one point, someone said, I think it was John, that in order to commit the straw man fallacy, one has to have the concept of an argument. I guess it's not really that clear to me. I could like represent your reasoning. I could say, you said such and such, and then you inferred such and such. That does not seem to me to require the concept of argument. And maybe related, I think you said that using the term therefore involves a weak meta level. What would you say to the objection that no, actually it's an illative, it's a constituent of the argument? How, it's a first order constituent. How could it possibly be even weakly meta level? And then, you might want to compare that to the term it follows that.
So I'll start with the second one last, and again, maybe this is just a puzzle about what meta means, and so therefore looks like it's different from just association. That you had a movement of mind versus you having a movement of mind that you endorse and see as appropriate is a different thing. And so therefore is supposed to be the sense that you didn't just something didn't just pop into your mind, that you might say saw it and said that's a good thing that happened. That it's constitutive of that means is to, again, that's the weak sense of meta, that all argument is in some ways got that self-evaluating element to it, that it's reflexive. With the second one, do you have to have the concept of argument to commit the straw man? And again, this is a close version to Dima's point, which is that it looks like you can have misunderstandings of something that somebody said, and even criticisms of them. Part of the error of straw manning, and this is again a controversial claim in the fallacy theory, is that the error of straw man is not in the misattribution, is not uniquely in the misattribution of a content to someone. The error of the straw man is in closing the argument on the basis of that. And so what you have to do is you have to say, this view, you don't have much more to say about this now, that, right? Because you can have instances where I mishear you, and then I start arguing about your mishearing, and that can be a good opening, right? I can misrepresent your view, and that can be a good opening for you to clarify it or for us to have a better conversation. Those are those are not that's not a fallacy. That's just good conversation. That's just us clarifying things by me just throwing things at you and saying, what do you think about that? And so that second part, the fallaciousness element, that's in the evaluative part. That's in the, there's not much more to be said here. There's not much more argument to be done. We need to cut our losses with this discussion and move on. This is a loser view. That's the part, that's the meta part. And that's where we're doing evaluative work about not just the reason that was given, but about whether or not this argument is still doable and whether or not you're a good representative, whether or not the opponent that we've attributed that view to is an appropriate person to continue this conversation with.
Okay. Okay, so you're saying that if I represent your view as moving from certain points to other points, that's not necessarily at the meta level, then what when I evaluate your argument as being poor, that component of the straw man, that is meta level. Yeah. Okay. Didn't you in the first slide promise to tell us what an argument is?
No.
We make a lot of promises. We can't be responsible
hey man, we only have
for things that were in slides.
Right. So we're starting with we're jumping into the controversial trifecta without really providing any definitions. That was more the, hey, this is going to be more fly by the seat of the pants and let the examples do the driving than the conceptual analysis do the driving.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gil.
Thank you.
So now we have Dina.
So hi, thanks so much for the talk. It was really a mental explosion for me personally, so I'm really thankful. So actually, before I make my deeper comment, just let me make a comment about your failure of a joke. I'm sorry. We could see that the joke was yours and you were both laughing about the painting. One of the problems is you assume that that's a wrong painting, but for me, for instance, it's not a wrong painting. It's actually the right painting. So I was like, oh, I wonder what they mean. So it slowed down. Anyway, that's my comment about the inside joke. But now about the meta. So I wonder, sorry, this is like, because there's so much stuff. But so one, let me be friendly about this fact that there is a weak meta maybe going on all the time, though we don't realize it. So it's like this sort of, so there might be qualities of meta that are not specified. So one. The second one is, however, we only notice the meta on certain occasions, right? Usually we don't, I would say we don't notice in the fallacy manner, but in actually the self-corrective manner. So something's gone wrong, we go back over the argument and we go like, oh, look, we were arguing with this assumption, but we don't share it. So we do the meta as a sort of self-corrective mode. So now, this seems to put the identification of fallacies versus, let's call it a more generous attitude towards why we do the meta in a different, I don't know how to call it, it's like a different picture, right? Sorry, my question's so long, but what I mean by this is, so that means that when somebody's like doing this free speech, you're like imposing on my free speech, it can be at the two level. It can be like, oh, you're not, so sorry, I'm imagining my son going, you're always like criticizing me, stop, because you're not allowing me to, make my own mistakes grow, I don't know. But if you get this sort of, let's call it, I don't know how to name them, but this sort of, I think they're annotatable positions, even though some people have them, but you have these positions and then somebody criticizes them and they say, oh, you're imposing on my free speech. Actually, what they're doing is, I wouldn't say they're doing meta level. Actually, they're on the first order level and they're saying, I don't want to argue. That's what they're saying. So I was like, so my question now. So how do we differentiate between something that looks like a meta-argument, but is a fallacy meta-argument, versus a sort of first order, refusal to argue. So there seems to be like a sort of opaque distinction. Oh, this was so long. I really apologize. But anyway, but your talk was great. Thank you so much.
I want to talk about I love the idea of, you might say, open society norms being used on the one hand to deflect criticism and say, hey, you're stepping on my free speech and things like that. And so it's a defensive tactic along those lines. And so I think that but I think that you're right, that that's not the extent of the use of that, right? So we have hey, you're the deflecting or the sort of the defeating or the proleptic use, which is I'm using my free speech. Why are you criticizing me? It's just free speech. And then the other one, the sort of the intensifying one, which is, hey, they're criticizing me. I must be onto something, right? I got to exercise the free speech. So those are the ones that are, you might say, purely epistemic ones. Then there's this other one, and I really like this observation, which is free speech norms also are free speech to you just being like, look, I don't feel like talking about it, right? Can we sort of rights of association, right? And just saying that those kind of norms are ones that that should allow folks to be able to sort of beg off conversations. We have those, for example, with the fact that there can be that some debates may have sort of high emotional costs for folks. So, for example, we have regular debates about here in the States, because we got racist folks here, regular debates about whether or not intelligence tracks race and race tracks intelligence. And one question that's regularly asked is like, first off, whether or not we have the debates at all the free speechy sort of questions at the beginning. But the second part of it is, well, think about like what sort of undue burdens that puts on researchers, right? From these groups that you might say, like asking them to debate these folks is a sort of a whole different kind of burden. Could there be a kind of like, look, don't worry about this. This isn't your problem right now, kind of question. So now I'll put it, I will back up and say, there are, you might say, sort of political norms of protecting folks and letting them live their lives. But then there are also epistemic norms of being able to defend positions, that if it's your position and you say it, and then you say, hey, I don't feel like arguing right now, is that right? And so, I mean, one question is whether or not those are sort of squarable norms, right? The epistemic norm is, and the sort of pragmadialectical norm is, hey, if you say stuff, you got to defend it, right? That's like, if you've got views and you say them out loud, you're kind of on the hook for defending them. Maybe you can press pause and say something like, yeah, I'm sleepy right now, or, give me a little bit to get my head together, or this is kind of a painful conversation. Can we come back whenever I'm in a better place? That's one kind of, do you never have to defend it? Are there just views where it's like, you say them and the free speech norms just says, yeah, you never really have to defend them. You just get to talk. I'm myself conflicted about it. I'm more inclined to say that free speech norms are set for the epistemic gains, and folks that don't do their epistemic duties in light of the benefits that they get from those rights are free, or you might say political and epistemic free riders. And I don't like free riders. That makes things bad for all of us, right? It's like that's people who cut in line. Okay, that's.
Yeah, there are a couple more questions. Not to drag it on, but I love the perspective of your question, and it reminds me of something that you sort of there are different avenues that you can go down with the meta-argumentative moves here, and one is the like you mentioned the meta-argumentative move of not arguing. If I'm not here to argue. It's reminiscent somewhat of an observation or an argument a meta-argument that Elizabeth Anderson made, that it's sort of a meta norm that, with regard to certain kinds of questions, the arguments are going to be crappy, and it's okay. So it's just there's a, with regard to these questions that are extremely uncomfortable or very cutting edge in the, from a certain perspective, you're going to have to violate first order norms, right? So, yeah, thank you.
I suppose Dima has another question.
Yes, I do. And it's still about the meta. So it's another question, but I think this meta is, but just a small clarification. When I was asking earlier about the strawman, I was not talking about misunderstandings. I was talking about distortions. Of course, I mean, you never know if someone is distorting, if they're misunderstanding, but I was not going there. I was just thinking that when you distort a claim or you distort a conclusion, but I agree with you that it's the closure, what you call the closure, that makes the straw man fallacy, because at the end you do it in order to attack a position, and that's the closure part. But there I would want to ask you, then don't you think that all fallacies that happen in refutation, and that's, so when you are trying to criticize, so whether you are asking the critical questions, so is it that every time you are making a judgment on your opponent's position, you are engaging in meta-argumentation? And I would be hesitant to go that far, because then, and I think that's what you were saying also in response to Martin's question, that then the meta would replace the dialectic, and I would say it would replace the dialectic, it would replace the whole interactive aspect of argumentation. And I'm not sure about that. I would say, like, for many reasons. First, if you think of it, I'm sure you are aware of the work of Scott Jacobs and Sally Jackson. And for them, argumentation from the discursive perspective is already a meta move. So you have the preference for agreement, and when there's disagreement, you go meta. So you engage in argument to repair a situation at the kind of interaction. So we are already at a meta level. And then if every time we react to the argument of the opponent, which is part of exchanging reasons, we are already at the meta level of the interaction. This is already a little bit too many metas, I think. Also, I'm not sure how useful it is to go there, because you still have, I think, you still need to account for cases when someone is meta about their own argument, which is of a different nature. So I think that I would say that when someone is reacting to the argument of the other in an argumentative interaction, it's less meta in the sense than when someone is really making a comment about the argument, his own argument. So in that sense, I would say all these senses of meta, of course, I think there's nothing wrong in describing them, but going for calling, let's say, the strawman fallacy or both siderism as meta-argumentative fallacies, while they seem only to me to be happening as fallacies when someone is refuting rather than defending their point of view. And of course, by default, when you refute, so when you try to react to someone else's position in an argument interaction, you are reflecting over the argumentation. So I would ask you, don't you think it's better to keep the interactive aspect as part of the argumentation, and only the meta that goes beyond the first order interaction to become a meta?
It's a great question, and that underscores, I think, an interesting way that this overlaps with what the dialectical feature of arguing. And I think I would, speaking for Scott here, I think I'd hesitate to identify the meta move with the dialectical move. I'd say those are distinct. The meta move is, or the meta, let's say the weakly meta feature of arguing, without having given a definition of argument, which we promised to do apparently. This is a present in argument understood as a product, right? So in that sense, it's not yet dialectical, even though we think, and we have reasons that it actually in this straw man stuff and elsewhere, we have a view about argument as fundamentally dialectical. I know Scott has written this recently in his Topoi contribution to the our adversarial one, that argument is fundamentally dialectical in the sense that reasons are contrastive by their nature. So our sense is not to look at the dialectical necessarily involving many, but just as a feature of reasons itself. And so that it's contrastive is a feature of the reasons, but it's not necessarily what makes them meta. If that makes sense. Maybe Scott has something to add.
Yeah, let me clarify one thing, because I feel like a thread kind of got left there, and maybe part of this is about like what the thickness of the thin, like even the thin notion of meta is pretty thick. That's okay. And here's one basic one, which is this contrastivism about reasons. So if we think, for example, that you've got evidence that your friend is drinking iced tea for lunch, on the basis of the fact that they've got, and so here's the evidence. They've got a glass and it's got a light brown liquid. There's ice in it and a little lemon slice and a straw. That looks like that's pretty good evidence. Assuming that your contrast classes, the things that you're trying to sort the iced tea from, are water, sodas, things like that, right? So that's pretty good evidence. And so, if it's lunch and it's at a deli, all of those things make that good evidence, right? So there's a whole bunch of other background business in the place, what you're sorting it from, the conditions under which you're doing it. All we need to do is just change the environment and the background things that you're sorting it from, right? It's like now you're having lunch in a bar and it's a Saturday, right? We're like, now there's the Long Island iced tea possibility. Like, it's an iced tea. It looks like iced tea, but it's really just brown liquor, right? Or white liquor with a little bit of brown on top, right? And so those are very different things. But again, the evidence can be very different, and you can get the exact same evidence, but the evidence is good or bad depending on certain other background things. And so what we're doing is we're sorting, and we're taking into account all those. And so that what was easy as a sort of a little bitty piece of sort of easy evidence for an inference that we made actually required a lot of other coordinating and us sort of saying, okay, what are the relevant sorting classes? What are the conditions under which I'm making this? And so even our weak sense of meta is actually pretty thick. If we're thinking, because we've got another substantive view that's, again, controversial, and totally aware of that. But the contrastivism about reasons looks like it's a really good way to be able to talk about why reason quality varies with context and things like that. We have a good story as to what context is. We don't have to invoke others. We can just invoke, we don't have to invoke others who we're in disagreement with for this to sort of have that thick element to it. You don't have to have somebody else who's like, that's not an iced tea. You don't have to have disagreement. You just have to have like the possibility of controversy under those conditions. And so that even that sort of dialectical element is something that you might say, you don't even need flesh and blood others saying nuh-uh to get dialectical elements to it. In that regard, we think that even the sort of the thin notion of meta is still pretty thick. Okay, thanks.
So we got 3 more questions. Pedro, Mani, and then again Gilbert. Pedro.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, so thank you a lot for the presentation. I'm having some troubles with my connection, so it was very frustrating. Some parts and then some of your answers, they got cut. So I hope I'm not well, but it's unlikely that what I'm going to say was already touched upon, and it's just a comment, and it's also about the meta thing. But now I'm referring to the meta elements that you identify in all arguments. And I was just it just occurred to me, and I have been since then trying to remind myself a little bit better of the text. But it just seemed like an interesting reference to share, probably just to remind you of, that small text from Lewis Carroll, what Achilles told the tortoise, or what the tortoise told Achilles. It seemed, I mean, it's probably an interesting place to to go to deal with this question. There's probably much more material available elsewhere with which to build an interesting case here, but it's just another idea, because if I remember well, what the text is all about is that you cannot have, let's say, the rules of inference for your calculus, or for, well, the rules of inference, they cannot be added to your argument as just another premise. So this seems to realize that meta element in a very flagrant way. So that was just it.
That is an excellent challenge, and it's one of the difficulties, I think, of the fact that on the one hand we have the fact that we can make explicit. So it's possible for the tortoise to say. So the example of Achilles, what the tortoise said to Achilles from Lewis Carroll, is that it's a special instance of, you might say, an inferential version of the Zeno problem for Achilles. Achilles would never be able to catch the tortoise because he has to travel halfway, and then in order to travel halfway, has to travel half of that halfway. He'd never get to the tortoise. Or the other version of it is that if he has to catch the tortoise, he has to catch where the tortoise is, but in order to catch up where the tortoise has moved, so he has to catch up to where the tortoise is next time. So the Achilles will never catch the tortoise. So that's Zeno. The Carroll version is that anytime Achilles is going to effectively use modus ponens, the tortoise asks.
I forgot to explain that thing.
Yeah, it's okay. I want to. The point of this is supposed to make the rule explicit, and then I can make a good answer, because the answer is not going to make any sense unless I frame it the right way. So so the tortoise asks Achilles to do modus ponens, but then in order for him to do modus ponens, the tortoise asks for each instance of modus ponens to be endorsed as a premise in the argument, and then he just has to do it again and again and again.
Yeah, because the opponent would just say, well, I don't feel compelled to make that inference. Why would I make that inference? And so
so notice, by the way, that the crucial thing about the Achilles and the tortoise instance is that the tortoise's challenge is to logically force me to accept the conclusion. And the important thing with that is that it looks like the tortoise isn't, nevertheless, it has to be reminded every time of the validity of that argument, right? Part of the thing about reflexive things is that, like, look, if you're not moved by modus ponens, a lot of other modus ponenses are not going to do it, right? The tortoise just doesn't look, the tortoise doesn't like modus ponens. Achilles keeps introducing modus ponens. What he really should do is reformulate the conditional as maybe a disjunction and introduce disjunctive elimination. But that's another strategy. But the point here is that I'm glad folks laughed at that. That's a good strategy. But the point here is that because the tortoise isn't doing it, we have to just keep going meta. That's the case of you might say a persistently non-cooperative interlocutor. And we all know that that's possible. The point here is supposed to just be that, like, look, if you've got people who are just not going to be argumentatively cooperative and not play along with any of the rules, you can't invoke the rules again to invoke them if they don't like the rules. That's, you might say, one of the, I think Gil had rightly said that it's a constitutive norm, but you still have to concede it as a constitutive norm. So I'm inclined to say that, like, look, the tortoise and the Achilles problem is not a problem with making it explicit. It's not a problem with meta languages. It's a problem with the fact that meta languages don't solve the problem with people who don't agree with the rules that you invoke. If the tortoise doesn't like modus ponens, a bunch more modus ponens isn't going to solve it. Is that an answer?
Mani?
Hi, and thank you. This is a follow-up of all those questions that you answered by distinguishing the weak and strong senses of meta. And so, well, like, the question is very simple, actually. I'm going to ask, what is the role, place, or relation of virtue approach to argumentation to your work? What do you think? I'm asking this precisely because, for instance, one of those instances that you distinguished between strong and weak versions Martin was, I think, for instance, trying to say something like, instead of the ground level arguments as products, maybe we are just talking about arguers and argumentation as a process. And you were kind of, I think, trying to appeal to a stronger or some kind of distinction between weak and strong, by way of maybe going even further to the, as you said, I'm quoting, taking more of the background into the context, into consideration. So I'm going to wonder, like, how do you see yourself as somehow related to the virtue approach? Thank you.
Well, I actually got a view on that in a totally separate thing from Scott, and where I think that so this is actually maybe not related to the, and this might not be a very good answer to your question, which is a great question. Thank you very much. Actually, let me illustrate this with the previous question, Pedro's question. One comment I would have to that, and it relates to this, is that, you know, there's a kind of a fundamental indirectness to what we're trying to do in arguing. So it's like, well, I want you to believe that P, right? I want you to believe that some proposition is true, or to take some attitude with regard to it. I can't tell you, I can't order you to do that. So my approach in trying to create that state into you is to take some indirect posture where I offer you something else. And that something else is then entails this thing. Now, sometimes, and this is the part that's relevant to Pedro, sometimes that's I do that in an extremely meta way. So here's his personal story, and I don't know how much time we have. This is not a long story, but I have some family relations who have are stance at a different part of the political spectrum from me, and we can't discuss those topics because they're, from my point of view, their source of information is corrupt. And it's just no fun anyway. So we discuss other topics, but I do this, maybe I'm a jerk for doing it, but you discuss those other topics in a way that is relevant. So it's like, say somebody's like, in modus ponens, I don't think modus ponens, but I do a bunch of modus ponenses in my discussions. Because in order to get them to kind of embrace that this is a proper way of doing reasoning. So I'm modeling so we talk about topics that are unrelated, but we do so in a way that's indirect to the, indirect, at least, that is related in terms of the scheme. So we're having kind of a meta argument. We have an argument whose content appears to be ducks, right? To go back to the Dutch hookbill example from the beginning of the talk, we look like we're talking about ducks, but what we're really talking about is argument schemes. Or we're talking, ducks are just a proxy for what the real disagreement is, because we can't confront the real disagreement. Now, in a sense, I think that you know, and I don't know if I'm going to make a tie very well here to virtue theory, is that the way, since our beliefs are indirect, we can't just will these things to be true. It's not like sports, right? Or some physical activity, you just learn it by doing it. You learn it by habituation and indirectly. So I think that speaks to the indirectness of the way the contents of arguments come out, speaks to a virtue theory, in the sense that the products or the targets of virtue theory are indirect themselves, right? You don't, I mean, you acquire states by practicing other things, and then but you can't go directly at the state. You acquire it indirectly by practicing being receptive to it, for instance. So your goal is to become a certain thing, but you get there circuitously. And I mean, that's kind of a predicament of argument, is that we're trying to, you know, so me and this family relation would like to have a conversation about whether P is true, but that doesn't happen. We don't just put P up there and say true or false, but we indirectly kind of circle around and dance around it, because that's the nature of that interaction. I think. So that's what I would have to say about virtue theory. Like I said, it wasn't exactly relevant to this project, but and I'm sorry to have taken air from that. So Scott can.
I got one small thing about that, which is, I mean, a lot of it depends on what kind of model of virtues you got. I mean, you like, everyone seems to be a neo-Aristotelian. Everyone seems to forget about Stoics. But I mean, if you're a neo-Aristotelian, you think that you're doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. Notice, by the way, that you might say, on the one hand, there's an element of you doing the right thing for the right reasons, and presumably there's a kind of a self-assessment. I mean, virtuous folks. Aristotle thinks that megalopsuchia is a good virtue. That's sort of great souledness. That's because of the fact that he thinks that keeping tabs on whether or not you're being virtuous is part of the virtues, right? It's like thinking well of yourself. It's like, I'm doing okay, right? I think that one of Aristotle's virtues is a kind of a meta virtue. It's a kind of it's a virtue of being like, hey, I'm doing all right. Like, look at me, I'm witty. I'm a little courageous, right? That seems very plausible to me. Okay, is that okay? Is that an all right answer? I mean, and the same thing can go with arguers. I think that arguers can do the same thing. They can just be like, look at this argument's doing okay. Everyone's shaking their heads. I think that it's right. You know what I mean? Okay.
Our last question for today is from Gilbert.
Okay. I'm still having trouble seeing therefore, and I assume you would say the same thing about so in the logical sense as weakly meta level. What would you say to the following points? One, that it's just expressing an inference or expressing that the inference is being made, or just expresses the inference. You said, I believe, that one indication that it is meta level is that it's weakly evaluative. Well, suppose, what about the case of insincere argument? Like, suppose I'm giving an argument by Trump. I'm not evaluating it positively.
I have a there are theories of inference interest me because take Boghossian, for instance. He takes inference to be a voluntary thing, right? Where and to be honest, we're kind of characterizing it in these terms. We haven't, of course, I don't know if we need to be on the hook here for a theory of inference. But I have a personal view, or a view in my I guess insofar as I am a solo person here, is that there is a fundamental sense in which inference is like belief in not voluntary. And so I'm compelled by that to, as a part of that belief, to conclude this other belief. So it's kind of like associate. So again, I can't stop drawing inferences. I just can't control it. So therefore it's involuntary in this sense, and which would be, I think, speak to your view a little bit, or your question, or what I'm taking your view to be. I'm inferring that from your question. I couldn't help but infer that from your question. That it's constitutive of a kind of a total process. Now, when we do argumentation and we get meta even weakly, we are asking ourselves, and this actually ties over to virtue theory a little bit, because again, we have this sort of involuntariness going on, but we try to develop the states of character where our automatic reaction is to do the courageous thing, or to be magnificent, right? Do there need to be games? Let me throw games for the whole city. I think these things automatically. So in a sense, you're right. You're right kind of the juncture of what inferring is. And it's tough to have an answer for that, because on the involuntarist picture that I kind of endorse in some ways, the so is part of the package, that the elements of argument aren't atoms that we put together and assemble like Legos, but they come together as organic bits, right? So we've got premise and conclusions are all together because they're part of our inferences, which we don't have a whole ton of control over, thus the need for virtue theory. So I don't know if that was a very satisfactory answer. That took me far away from Scott's view.
I think that's well put. I think that's the orientation that I'm coming from. I still would like to hear your take on insincere arguments.
Yeah, I was totally lying about that. So that was not actually my view. So that's my take.
I get it.
Just kidding.
You answered both questions at once.
Scott, did you have a?
Yeah, I'll be really short about it. Yeah, I think that expressive theories have a problem with indirect discourse. That's just the case with all of them, right? Like if you're a kind of an expressivist that therefores and goods and things like that, are you expressing your endorsement or your hoorays? It's hard to do them in indirect discourse, right? And say things. So I agree. I think that's right. And notice, by the way, that lying has got the same thing. I think that might be a reason for me to say something like, I mean, it makes it very difficult for someone then it makes it very difficult under these conditions to talk about arguments as bad. Because if you're going to be talking about them as arguments and you say a therefore in between those sorts of things, am I expressing the endorsement? And then say, no, that doesn't follow. I think that one of the things that the meta element I think helps with is that it kind of in some ways works as you also keeping tabs on yourself. So like one thing that I think makes the therefores different from just the things that you arrive at by association is that in some ways there's still causal processes internal to you, but one of them is a causal process that you endorse, right? The other one is that you're just like, here I am right here, like what happened here. The other one is that like in some ways you kind of just did a kind of a that you liked your liking, you know what I mean? Where it's like you kind of have got meta desires. You're like like there are some desires that I have, and then I'm like, yay! But then I'm like, but I don't want to like that. You know what I mean? Surely there are things that are like that. Television shows, pieces of food, maybe people in your life. You're like, I like them, but I shouldn't like them. I don't want to like them. And I think that inferences are the kinds of movements of mind that you like, and you want to, and you think that, and you also say, yeah, and I like that I like them. I think that they've kind of got that endorsement element. So there are things that you find yourself endorsing, and whenever you say, when you say therefore, you kind of did the illative stuff, but you also say, I say, yep, and yep to my yep. So I think that's the part that we're kind of doing, that we're endorsing kind of how we got there. There are other things that we get there. We're like, what the hell? What happened? That's not that you don't say therefore then, right? You say something else. You say, who am I thinking this thought, right? Or something like that. You don't say therefore, you say something else.
Yeah, I like that he said that. I also like that. I like that he said that. And I like that as well.
I know that Pedro has a follow-up, so if you agree, I would still give the floor to him.
It's super quick. I think, I mean, some of the things that you said after, I was not completely sure if my point got through. I was just using the rules of inference. I was positioning them at the same level of the therefore, or what you say when you finish an argument when you finish a proof and you write the Q, ED. So there is a reference to what you have just been said. So there's a meta level right there. I'm not sure if this is enough. Maybe this is the weak level that you're talking about, but I was just trying to make myself clear there. So thanks.
I absolutely love that point, which is because it's not just saying therefore, it's also invoking the demonstration, right? And in that regard, there's a lot of other micro endorsements. It's not just a sort of one big macro endorsement. There are a lot of other, like, you like the whole thing because you like how all the little things that you endorse also fit together. I think that QED is like one of those instances where you're just like, that in some ways is not just spiking the ball, right? Or that's a football reference. That is a certain kind of like a goal celebration that you take off your shirt or something like that for our European football playing fans. But it's also saying something like, and not only am I celebrating it, given our agreements, you should celebrate it too. You shouldn't just like it. You should like that you like it. Is that okay?
And also, Eric, as a follow-up, please.
Yeah, this is just a short follow-up too. So first, I think that you didn't mention it, but if I'm not mistaken, Frege's theory of judgments is a connection between senses. So that would be one theory of inference, I think, if you want to call it so, that satisfies this weak meta. But I'm a bit skeptical about these kind of theories because, in a sense, so the question is this about cognition? And if it is about cognition, do you really need it to be about cognition? Because it seems like a can of worms that is opened by this. And maybe you can just avoid this and say, have the strong notion of meta only, because I mean, if it's about cognition, well, I mean, you can say a lot about cognition, and I would not subscribe to these kind of symbolic views when you have content and then there's something about the content that makes it meta. The problem is, of course, that is so theory dependent and so dependent on the representation you're stipulating. So it's just a comment about it.
Yeah,
Frege's theory might be interesting.
No, that's a great point. I think it certainly, as we started thinking about this, it's nice to have a clean sense of meta being everything being derived from kind of some fundamental thing, but there's a trap in there that I mean, in a sense, it's a meta trap that it's just, you're going to go meta in the other direction. Micro meta. Thank you.
Yeah, let me add just one small thing, which is, I mean, the irony about all this was that we were trying to just start with the strong sense of meta and say, we need the strong sense of meta to do these fallacies. And that's what we wanted the theory about. The irony is that we kind of got dragged back in, and it's no longer a controversy trifecta. Now it's a controversy quadrifecta, because now we got cognition and inference, like a pentafecta, but however many more that we need there. And, you know, in some ways that's, I'll pat myself on the back, but also give an apology, which is that does show that there in some ways that there's something to this problem, which is that like it looks like it connects up with a lot of other things. That it looks like if we can get something right about this, maybe some other things get right in other places. Or we might just say something like, no, it just magnifies the fact that this is just maybe a hopeless enterprise. Have you ever seen the meme where the kid is sliding down the slide and everything looks like it's out of control, and it looks like, and the little caption says, when you start thinking about a philosophical problem and realize it's connected to 1,000 other philosophical problems. That's how we feel right now.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you again for being here with us virtually, and also I'd like to thank you all for your participation and for the great discussion. Let me say something about our next colloquium that will be at the end of February, on February 26th. Our guest will be Fabio Paglieri. I hope to see you all also on that occasion. In the meantime, stay safe and well. Ciao.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great seeing everybody.
Well, we can have a drink here in Europe now.
Yeah, we can have a drink here in Chicago.